A young woman from a small, typically safe town vanishes without a trace.
We have no doubt somebody out there knows what happened to Tara.
A young woman's disappearance made national headlines, and it rocked the small community of Belen. To this day, her family and friends are still searching for answers.
In this video, we're going to look at a number of suspects in the case. We will also look at the possibility that this case has yet to be solved because of a cover-up. A good part of the information comes from the podcast Vanished, the Tara Calico investigation, and we highly recommend it for anyone wishing to take a deep dive into this sad and often bewildering case. Before we look at some of the names that have come up, we have to make it clear that everyone mentioned is innocent until proven guilty. The first person we will discuss is J.J. Aguayo. He was on the road that day with a friend called Paul Zieler. He openly admits he saw Tara cycling her bike. One of the first people to put his name forward as a person of interest was Ishmael De La Rosa. De La Rosa told police that Jack Aguayo, JJ's grandfather, believed his grandson knew more than he was letting on. On the day they saw Tara, they were carrying out some target practice on a road sign along Highway 47. They intended to go hunting the next day with a third man. JJ was unable to remember the name of this person, but he states he was to take them hunting. This man pulled out, and JJ states that he believes he left New Mexico and probably the country. When the man pulled out of the hunting trip, JJ asked his grandfather for a lend of his truck. His grandfather declined on the basis that neither JJ nor his friends were trustworthy. It seems they used Paul Zieler's truck on the 21st, and the two left Belen for a period of between 2 and 4 days. While Aguayo admits seeing Tara, Paul Zieler says he never seen her or can't remember ever seeing her. Another statement from a local Belen girl has also been obtained by the Vanished podcast team. In it she says that JJ brought her to a, and I quote, creepy house near Escondida Lake. She says there was a foul smell at the house. She also states that she went with him to a nearby cave, which had been converted into a living quarters, though nobody resided there at the time. JJ asked her if she knew Tara, and he talked incessantly about her, which would no doubt make the setting all the more disconcerting. Apparently he let on that he had information on what happened to her, though he never claimed he had done it or partook in any actions against Tara. Not long after her disappearance, he moved to Texas, and this has fueled suspicion. He also had connections with another suspect, a Lawrence Romero Jr. When talking of Lawrence Romero Jr., it's important that we make a number of things clear about another individual connected to him. Lawrence Jr. is the son of Sheriff Lawrence Romero Sr., the man who headed the initial investigation into the disappearance of Tara. There have been a number of accounts given by a range of different people that possibly implicate Lawrence in the disappearance of Tara. We've decided to begin with a taped interview of a woman who stated a friend of Lawrence, Scott Cunningham, had told his then girlfriend that a throwaway comment had been made by Lawrence regarding Tara's disappearance. At some point after she had gone missing, Scott was picked up by Charlie Hooton and Lawrence Romero Jr. They also had a girl with them. According to the interviewee, they had brought this girl up to the mountains and engaged in sexual relations. As to whether it was consensual, the woman being interviewed was unsure. During the engagement, Scott heard one of the men say, and I quote, "This is just like Tara." When he turned around, the girl had hit her head on a rock. The interviewee then said, and I quote, "They proceeded to pick the girl up, prop her up against the back seat, and drive Scott back home, from North 14 through Albuquerque to the residence where he lived. They dropped him off, and he never knew what they did with the girl, and he claims he didn't know the girl's name." Police interviewed Scott. His description differs in a number of aspects. He said he was picked up by Lawrence and Charlie, who were with a girl. He got into the car and went with them to the mountains. They were drinking, and he made a physical advance on the girl, which she reproached. Being angry, she walked away from the group for a time, but came back. he states she was severely intoxicated and Lawrence wanted to take advantage of her. It was at this stage that he made the following comment, which Scott relays here while being interviewed by police.
When she was laying on the ground, all this was going on, Lawrence made the comment to me, or it was looking at me. Charlie was standing there and he said, this is, I'm trying to remember his exact words here. He said, this kind of reminds you of the Terra Calico, doesn't it? And it was fairly convincing. That's when I said, I'm not into this.
Scott then says Charlie Hooton took him away and Scott heard him admonishing Lawrence.
And Charlie took him off, pulled him off in the bushes away from me, and I could hear him telling me, you need to shut up. What the are you doing? And it was extremely convincing. And ever since that day, I thought that they were involved. I knew they were involved somehow.
Not long after, they had to pull her into the car in a semi-conscious state. The group then returned to Belen, where Scott says he was dropped off at his parents' house. He says he doesn't know what happened to the girl after this, and he never saw her again. In the interviews with Scott Cunningham, it comes across as though he is giving partial truths. I have no doubt that he did go up to the mountains with Lawrence, Charlie and an unknown girl. As to whether his statements regarding the night are wholly true, well, the only thing that can be said is that his account differs to an account he gave to other people around him while living in California. In these, he doesn't seem to be sure whether the girl was alive or dead. He says they bundled her into the back of a Volkswagen Rabbit. He was then dropped home, and he heard nothing of her again. Either way, we have another person who ties Lawrence Romero Jr. and Charlie Hooton to the disappearance of Tara, and he won't be the last person to do so. In the last video, we mentioned a witness who was likely the first to see Tara on her bike ride on that fateful Tuesday morning. In her statement to police, she said she pulled out in front of a slow-moving truck on the morning Tara disappeared. While in the process of carrying out this manoeuvre, she turned her head in the direction of those driving the vehicle. She stated 2 men were in it, and the driver had a look on his face that unsettled her. The faces were familiar to her, and she picked 2 men as those in the truck from a mugshot book shown to her by investigating officers. At the time, she couldn't put a name to them. This changed when Lawrence Romero Jr. was found dead after a self-inflicted gunshot wound sustained in 1991. The incident has been reported as a suicide or a death by misadventure, brought about during a drunken drug-fueled game of Russian roulette. When the incident was reported in the paper with an attached photo of Lawrence, the girl recognised him immediately as the man who was in the passenger seat of the truck behind Tara. She seemed to be spooked by the realisation that the man she had saw in the passenger seat was the son of Lawrence Romero Sr., the former sheriff of Belen. There are 2 pieces of information I am going to talk about here. Both are related to a former deputy called Frank Methola. One comes from a 22-page State of New Mexico incident report in which Frank Methola gives details of a conversation he had with Henry Brown, a former neighbour of Lawrence Romero Jr. The other is a short statement given by Henry Brown, which we will summarise. Some doubts have been expressed with regard to the credibility of Frank Methola's incident report, but his report about a visit to a Henry Brown has been deemed more credible and fixed. Doubts arise because his story has changed over the years, according to Melinda Esquivel, host of the podcast Vanished. She has had access to the case files and believes that Henry Brown's original account has been added to by Methola. In the intervening years, rumours which have done their rounds in the small town of Belen have been said to emanate from Henry Brown, when they may simply be allegations affixed to his name. The reason we will include the statement given by Methola is because so many of the accounts which might explain what happened to Tara are rumour, yet similar accounts are given and the same names keep popping up. The viewer can decide whether they are of value or not. Methola was called to Henry Brown's property on September the 17th, 2006. Mr. Henry Brown, who was gravely sick at the time, made a complaint about bees which were causing problems on his property. The complaint related to his neighbour, who he believed was responsible for the uptick in the unwanted guests. Mathola's response was that there was nothing much he could do, as no law was being broken by his neighbour. Accepting this to be the case, Mr. Brown asked if he could divulge information relating to the Tara Calico case. Mr. Brown stated that in November 1988, his neighbour, the same person he was making a complaint against, called him over to his property 2 homes west of Mr. Brown's. He stated that his neighbour had made a basement underneath his mobile home and wanted him to have a look at it. He says his neighbour was nervous when taking him down into his basement. Brown says he observed what he believed to be a shallow grave on the floor of the basement. His neighbour began talking about Tara Calico while in a state of intoxication. Brown then goes on to say that he saw his neighbour cover the homemade basement and put a concrete slab over it. He also states that he questioned his neighbour about his involvement in the disappearance of Tara. After asking, his neighbour threatened to kill him if he said anything to anyone about the basement. Mr. Brown also stated that his neighbour sent a gunman to his home to kill him. He said he had reported this incident to the Valencia County Sheriff's Department. Mathola advised Brown that a detective would come to his house to make a statement. Mr. Brown concluded with the remark, "I know that Tara Calico is under that mobile home that his neighbour owns and rents out." On reading this statement, we could conclude it to be nothing more than the words of a disgruntled neighbour. It's hard to say. However, other statements of Mathola have come to the fore, and it's been reported that Henry Brown was the person who provided him with the information. From what is on record, only one report was made by Henry Brown, and the summary of that was mentioned before. What you will see next is a statement made by Mathola, who attributes what he says to Henry Brown. It is this statement that has led to social media speculation regarding Tara's final few hours, in particular these lines, and I quote, "They, Lawrence Romero Jr. and some friends, were driving one of the guy's older trucks that day. They all knew that Jeffa Beta and Tara had broken up, and they all knew she rode her bike down the highway. They explained they hit her with the truck and put her in the back of the truck with Leroy Chavez, and then took her out to the gravel pits where they, I will paraphrase the next part, engaged in non-consensual sex. Lawrence Romero Jr. said she got ballsy, stood up, and she said she was going to make sure they were all going to jail. Lawrence Romero Jr. went and got a knife from the truck, and David, Leroy and the tall red-haired guy held her down while Lawrence Romero Jr. stabbed and killed her. He said they dragged her body and put her in a bush nearby until they got nervous when the search started for her. He said, he being Henry Brown, they joked that they kept her nearby. Mr. Brown believed she was hidden in the grave in the basement because no one would look for her there. As you can see, this account is vastly different to the one documented. Melinda Esquivel, the podcast host, who has researched the case in detail, believes it's a hodgepodge of rumours circulating around the town in subsequent years. One unnamed man, who was a childhood friend of Lawrence and Charlie Hooton, says that he, and I quote, walked up on them in the van one night and they were talking. It was Charlie Hooton, Lawrence Romero Jr., Scott Cunningham, and another person whose name has been silenced in the podcast interview with Melinda Esquivel. He goes on to say, I specifically heard them say, don't tell the unnamed person where they hid the body of Tara Calico. He goes on to say that a lot changed for a number of these men in the aftermath of Tara's disappearance. Not long after she went missing, a number of the men whose names repeatedly come up left Belen. Lawrence and Charlie went to Hawaii, Scott Cunningham went to California, and J.J. Aguayo went to Texas. Lawrence would return from Hawaii before Charlie and would die before his return. But when Charlie came back, he was a different man. He was heavily dependent on alcohol and drugs, and according to this person, talked of Tara haunting him. He would later be found dead with an apparent suicide note pinned to his body. One thing that can't be denied is that Lawrence Romero Jr.'s name comes up time and time again. He is seen by a witness in the morning as a passenger in a light-coloured pickup truck, Scott Cunningham, alludes to a comment he made which implicated him in the death, and there does seem to be a number of rumours going around the local area suggesting he was involved directly in Tara's death. The reports of what happened tally with a statement made by Sheriff Rivera, who replaced Lawrence Romero Sr. in 2008 while still acting sheriff. He came out publicly saying he knew what happened to Tara. The Valencia County News Bulletin reported the following. Rivera received information over the years that two men, who were teenagers at the time of Tara's disappearance, found her riding her bike on the rural road that day and had help afterwards disposing of her body. He continued by saying that the two men were taunting Tara with the pickup truck. They hit her bike, causing her to lose control and fall off. They kidnapped her and killed her when she threatened to expose their deeds. The reason, according to Rivera, that he wasn't able to act on this information is because there was no definitive evidence to convict and there was no body, nor did they, the authorities, know where it may be located. Rivera did say he believed it was still in Valencia County. Family and friends of Tara wanted him to release the names of the suspects. He didn't, and said he had released the information in the hope that new information might come forward. This account clearly lines up with that given by Frank Mithola. Many have said the reason the case was never solved was because Lawrence was the son of Sheriff Lawrence Romero Sr., a powerful man in the area. This would explain why there was no follow-up on the information given by the woman who saw Tara and the truck following on the morning she vanished. When authorities showed her mugshots, she picked out Lawrence Romero Jr., yet from all accounts, he was never interviewed or asked to account for his movements on the morning of September 20th. This does raise a good deal of suspicion. We also know that Lawrence Romero Jr. was involved in the sale of drugs in the Valencia County area. Some who knew him point out that his father was known as someone who had a lot of success busting other drug dealers, in particular those in the methamphetamine trade. Many speculate, with good reason, that he was removing the competition. It may also be the reason why so many people have remained silent in the community of Belen. Once again, we'll never know for certain. This has been a strange case to examine. There is the photo connected with the case. For the most part, it has been determined that the girl in it is not Tara Calico. Added to this, there is the circumstantial evidence pointing towards Lawrence Romero Jr. and a number of his acquaintances being responsible for her disappearance. Police's failure to interview him in the aftermath of the disappearance certainly raises a good number of questions, especially when someone's seen him in the truck matching the description given by several members of the public. Time and time again, his name comes up and the same similar story is relayed by multiple sources. However, without the questioning needed to pry out the information, we can only conclude that he is a strong suspect in the case. A suspect who can no longer offer any answers to the remaining family members of Tara Calico. We will conclude this video with a few words on Tara. While researching the case, we came across many instances indicating her warm, friendly and caring nature. From befriending a new girl at her high school who was finding it difficult to make new friends in her new environment, or the conscientious way she handled her relationships with family. She was ambitious, responsible, and had an eye on a future that promised so much for this intelligent young lady. Unfortunately, like in so many other cases, any prospect of fulfilling her dreams were robbed. More than likely, by an uncaring, callous and cowardly group of young men who paid no heed to the human potential possessed by Tara. Though it appears unlikely, we hope and pray that our family receives some answers in the coming years. We believe members of the public know what happened to her and may have an idea of where her remains lie. One can only wish that they come forward. Once again, thanks to everyone for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to like, comment, share and subscribe to Mystery Scope. As always, until the next time, Take care.